It was just after midnight when I heard the knock. I had been lying in bed, not quite asleep, but not awake either, suspended in that liminal space where thoughts drift like smoke. The sound came soft but insistent, 3 careful taps against my door that seemed to echo through the quiet of my small apartment. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. The building was old, full of settling sounds and phantom noises that played tricks on residents who lived alone. But then it came again. 3 taps, deliberate this time. I pulled myself from the warmth of my sheets, bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The apartment was dark except for the amber glow of the streetlight filtering through my bedroom window. I made my way to the front door, my hand hesitating on the deadbolt. Who knocked at midnight? In 2 years of living here, no one had ever knocked at midnight. Through the peephole, I saw him. Desmond, my neighbor from across the hall, the one I had shared maybe a dozen conversations with in passing. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, his dark hair damp and clinging to his forehead. Even through the distorted lens, I could see he was shivering. I unlocked the door and opened it. Cool air from the hallway rushing past me. Up close, he looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. He wore gray pajama bottoms and a navy sweatshirt that hung loose on his frame. His eyes, usually bright with easy confidence, were shadowed and tired. "Keep me warm," he said, his voice low and half apologetic, as if he were asking for something far more complicated than shelter from the cold. Before I could respond, before I could ask what had happened or why he was standing in my doorway at this hour, he stepped past me into my apartment. Not pushing, not demanding, but moving with a quiet certainty that suggested he had been thinking about this moment longer than I realized. He went straight to my couch, that secondhand piece I had bought when I first moved in, its brown leather worn soft in places from years of use by previous owners. He pulled the cream-colored throw blanket from where it always rested over the armrest, shaking it out with practiced ease. Then he settled into the corner, pulling the blanket around his shoulders like a shield. I stood there by the open door, feeling the hallway's cold air seep into my space. Watching this man, I barely knew make himself at home in my living room. There was something both intimate and surreal about the moment, like stepping into a dream where the rules of normal interaction no longer applied. He looked up at me then, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and patted the cushion beside him. Not urgently, not desperately, but with a kind of quiet invitation that made my chest tighten in ways I did not want to examine. I closed the door, the soft click of the latch, somehow, final, and moved toward the couch. Every step felt deliberate, weighted with a significance I could not name. When I sat down beside him, leaving what I thought was a respectable distance between us, he shifted closer immediately. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt the warmth of his body seeping through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. Outside, rain began to tap against the window, a gentle percussion that seemed to underscore the strange intimacy of the moment. The streetlight cast long shadows across my living room, transforming familiar furniture into something foreign and dreamlike. My bookshelf, usually so orderly, looked like a dark monolith. The coffee table seemed to float in the amber half-light. We sat in silence, and I found myself hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, steady but slightly too quick. The way he held the blanket, not quite tight enough to hide the fact that his hands were trembling slightly. The smell of rain and something else, something warm and clean that might have been his soap or his skin. I realized with a clarity that felt both sudden and inevitable that this was not about the weather. Desmond was not the kind of person who knocked on doors at midnight because of a little rain. He was the kind of person who walked through thunderstorms without an umbrella, who forgot to bring a jacket to outdoor concerts and laughed when friends scolded him for it. He was careless with his comfort in a way that suggested he had never truly needed to worry about where warmth would come from. But here he was in my apartment, asking me to keep him warm. I thought about all the times I'd seen him in the hallway, coming and going at odd hours with guitar cases and canvas bags, always seeming to be in motion towards something or away from something else. He had a restless energy that I envied, a way of moving through the world that suggested he believed good things were always waiting around the next corner. I, by contrast, had built my life around predictability. My graduate program in history, my neat apartment, my careful routines. I woke at the same time every morning, made coffee in the same blue mug, read for exactly 2 hours before allowing myself to check email. I crave stability in the way some people craved adventure, but sometimes, late at night, when I could not sleep, I wondered if I was suffocating under the weight of my own careful choices. Now Desmond was beside me on my couch, close enough that I could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, and I felt something shift inside me. A loosening, like a knot I had not realized I was carrying, finally beginning to come undone. The rain continued its quiet drumming against the glass, and the night stretched ahead of us, vast and full of possibility. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was not empty. It was charged, expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. I found myself studying his profile in the dim light, the curve of his jaw, the way his eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks when he blinked. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost accidental, as if he had never thought to arrange his features for maximum effect, but had ended up striking anyway. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were darker than I remembered, pupils wide in the low light. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I felt something pass between us, some wordless understanding that changed the temperature of the room. This was not about warmth, I realized. This was about need, about the kind of loneliness that cannot be fixed with blankets or hot tea or any of the simple comforts we tell ourselves will be enough. The night stretched on, and neither of us moved to break the spell. I had always been the kind of person who needed order to breathe properly. At 22, I had already constructed my life with the precision of an architect designing a cathedral. Every beam and buttress serve a purpose, every detail carefully planned to support the weight of my ambitions. My apartment reflected this need for control. Books arranged by subject, then by author, spines aligned with military precision along the shelves. The kitchen counter clear except for a single coffee mug, washed and dried each morning before I left for campus. Curtains drawn most evenings, creating a barrier between my careful world and whatever chaos might be unfolding beyond my windows. I was pursuing my master's degree in history, specializing in the quiet revolutions that happened in parlors and private letters rather than on battlefields. I found comfort in the past, in stories that had already reached their conclusions, where all the variables were known and the outcome certain. My thesis advisor called me methodical, which I took as the compliment it was intended to be. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment felt too quiet and too small, I wondered if I was building a life or building a tomb. If my need for stability was protection or suffocation. Those were the thoughts I pushed away quickly, buried under the weight of deadlines and research notes and the steady rhythm of academic achievement. Desmond lived differently. I had been watching him for 2 years without meaning to, the way you notice the weather or the changing seasons. He was 23, a year older than me, but somehow ageless in the way that restless people often are. He played music, though I was never sure if that meant he played in coffee shops or subway stations or basement venues that only existed on certain nights of the week. His apartment was directly across the hall from mine, and sometimes when I came home from the library, I would catch glimpses of his space when his door was open. It was the opposite of mine in every conceivable way. Guitars leaning against walls like old friends, sheets of music scattered across surfaces, candles burned down to stubs on windowsills. The air that drifted out smelled of incense and possibility and something indefinable that might have been freedom. He kept strange hours, leaving with instrument cases and canvas bags at times when most people were settling in for the night. I would hear his footsteps in the hallway at 2 in the morning, always quick and light, as if he were perpetually late for something wonderful. Sometimes he brought people home, voices and laughter filtering through the thin walls until dawn. But more often than not, he came home alone, and I would hear only the sound of his guitar through the walls, melodies that seemed to drift and wander without ever quite resolving. We had shared maybe a dozen conversations in 2 years, the kind of casual exchanges that happen between neighbors who are friendly but not quite friends. He would hold the elevator for me when my arms were full of books, making jokes about the weight of knowledge while I fumbled for my keys. I would sign for packages when he was not home, leaving sticky notes on his door with the careful handwriting I had perfected in graduate school. There was something magnetic about him, a quality that drew people into his orbit without effort. He had the kind of smile that made you feel like you were sharing a secret, even when he was just saying good morning. His laugh was infectious, the kind that made you want to say funnier things just to hear it again. But I had learned to keep my distance, to appreciate him the way one might appreciate a beautiful painting in a museum. From far enough away to see the whole composition, close enough to admire the technique, but never close enough to touch. I told myself this was wisdom, that people like Desmond were meant to be admired, not pursued, that his restless energy and my need for stability were fundamentally incompatible, like trying to build a house on shifting sand. Except now he was on my couch, asking me to keep him warm. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the window, and I found myself studying the way the streetlight played across his features. In my ordered world, he was chaos made beautiful. In my careful life, he was the variable I had not planned for. He shifted slightly, the blanket sliding down from one shoulder, and I caught a glimpse of his collarbone, the hollow of his throat. Something tightened in my chest, a recognition I had been avoiding for longer than I cared to admit. Because the truth was, I'd been watching him for reasons that had nothing to do with neighborly curiosity. I'd been cataloging the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, memorizing the particular way he laughed when he talked on the phone, noting which nights his apartment stayed dark and which nights it glowed with warm light until dawn. I had been careful not to examine these observations too closely, filing them away in the same mental drawer where I kept all the other thoughts that threatened to complicate my carefully constructed existence. But now, with him beside me in the amber half-light, that drawer was beginning to overflow. The silence between us stretched on, comfortable but charged with undercurrents I was afraid to name. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, but inside my apartment, time seemed suspended, as if we existed in a pocket universe where normal rules did not apply. I realized that everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted and what I could handle, was about to be tested in ways I had never anticipated. 3 nights later, he knocked again. I was in my kitchen this time, standing at the counter with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, when I heard those same 3 careful taps. My heart did something irregular against my ribs, a flutter of recognition that I tried to dismiss as coincidence. But when I opened the door, there was Desmond again, this time wearing dark jeans and a gray hoodie, his hair still damp, but from a shower rather than rain. "My heater's acting up," he said with that crooked grin I was beginning to memorize, stepping past me with the same quiet certainty he had shown before. "Think I could borrow some warmth again?" I nodded, though he was already making his way to the couch, pulling the throw blanket around his shoulders like he belonged there. Like this was becoming routine. And perhaps it was. He began showing up more often after that, sometimes with explanations that sounded reasonable in the moment, but felt thin in daylight. His apartment was too cold. The people upstairs were being loud. He could not sleep and did not want to be alone with his thoughts. Each excuse delivered with that same half-apologetic tone, as if he were asking for something more complicated than the use of my couch. Sometimes he arrived early in the evening, appearing at my door just as I was settling in with dinner and a book. Other times he came late, after midnight, when the building had gone quiet and the hallways felt like empty stages waiting for actors who would never arrive. Each time, he claimed the same corner of the couch. Each time, I joined him without being asked. We developed an unspoken protocol. I would make tea if he seemed restless, coffee if the night felt long ahead of us. He would arrange the blankets, always ensuring there was enough to share, always positioning himself so that when I sat down there would be no choice but closeness. We talked sometimes about books I was reading or songs he was working on, conversations that meandered like streams finding their way downhill. But more often we sat in comfortable silence, the kind that felt rare and precious in a world that seemed to demand constant noise. One evening in early November, he arrived carrying a thermos and wearing a smile that seemed different somehow, more genuine than his usual careful charm. "Hot chocolate," he announced, settling onto the couch and unscrewing the cap. Figured it was my turn to provide the warmth. The chocolate was rich and dark, with a hint of cinnamon that lingered on my tongue. We passed the thermos back and forth, our fingers brushing each time we made the exchange, small touches that felt both accidental and inevitable. You know, he said, staring at the steam rising from the thermos, sometimes I think you're the only person who actually knows how to be quiet anymore. I considered this, the way his voice had gone soft around the edges. Most people think quiet is empty space that needs to be filled. Exactly, he said, turning to look at me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. But with you it feels full, like the quiet means something. There was something vulnerable in his expression, a crack in the easy confidence he usually wore like armor. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to understand what need was driving him to my door night after night, but I was afraid of the answer. Afraid that naming it would make it real, would force us to acknowledge what was building between us in these shared silences. Instead, I took another sip of chocolate and let the moment settle around us like falling snow. As the weeks passed, our nocturnal meetings took on the quality of ritual. He would knock, I would open the door, we would arrange ourselves on the couch with the practiced ease of dance partners who had learned each other's steps. Sometimes he brought provisions, tea bags he had stolen from coffee shops, a bottle of wine he claimed was payment for my hospitality, packets of hot chocolate mix that appeared in his pockets like magic tricks. But increasingly, he arrived empty-handed, carrying nothing but that same quiet need that seemed to grow stronger with each visit. One night, as we sat watching the shadows shift across my living room walls, he spoke into the darkness with a voice so soft, I almost missed it. "You're better company than being alone," he murmured, the words seeming to surprise him even as he said them. I laughed softly, but the sound felt hollow even to my own ears. Inside, his words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful calm I had built around my feelings for him. Because I was beginning to understand that Desmond did not just come to my apartment for warmth or quiet or escape from whatever restlessness drove him through the city at odd hours. He came for something I was afraid to name, something that lived in the space between us when we sat close enough to feel each other breathing. He came for me, and I was finally ready to admit that I had been waiting for him all along. The couch became our country, a small sovereign nation with its own customs and unspoken laws. By December, Desmond's visits had taken on the inevitability of seasons changing. He would arrive sometime between 10 and midnight, never at the same hour, but always with that same quiet certainty, as if he carried a key to my apartment that I had never given him, but that somehow belonged to him anyway. We had stopped pretending there were reasons. No more broken heaters, or noisy neighbors, or sleepless nights that needed explaining. He would knock, I would open the door, and he would settle into his corner of the couch with the familiarity of coming home. Sometimes we fell asleep there, tangled under the cream-colored blanket like cats seeking warmth. I would wake in the morning to find my head resting against his shoulder, or his knee pressing against my hip, our bodies having found each other in sleep with a naturalness that felt both shocking and inevitable. The first time it happened, I lay still for long minutes, afraid to move and break whatever spell had allowed this contact. His breathing was deep and even, his face relaxed in a way I had never seen it while awake. There was something almost heartbreaking about how young he looked when he slept, how the restless energy that usually animated his features had settled into perfect stillness. I studied the curve of his jaw, the way his dark lashes rested against his cheeks, the small scar above his left eyebrow that I had never noticed before. In sleep, he seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, like a secret someone had trusted me to keep. When he woke, we did not talk about it. We moved apart with careful casualness, gathering ourselves like people who had stumbled into intimacy by accident rather than by design. But something had shifted between us, some line crossed that we could not uncross. The next night, when sleep took us again on the couch, I did not lie awake cataloging his features. Instead, I let myself sink into the warmth of his presence beside me, into the steady rhythm of his breathing, into the particular weight of his arm where it had settled across my waist sometime in the deepest part of the night. This became our new normal. We would sit and talk or sit in silence, sharing the space between us with increasing boldness. Sometimes his hand would rest on the back of the couch, his fingers close enough to brush my shoulder when I leaned forward. Sometimes I would stretch my legs out, and he would make room for them without comment, as if accommodating each other's bodies was as natural as breathing. One night in mid-December, I woke to find him watching me, not in a way that felt invasive or uncomfortable, but with a kind of quiet attention that made my chest flutter with recognition. The streetlight threw amber patterns across the walls, and in that golden half-light, he looked like something from a painting, beautiful and slightly unreal. "How long have you been awake?" I whispered, not wanting to disturb the hushed quality of the moment. "A while," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You were dreaming." "About what?" He smiled, a small curve of his lips that I felt more than saw in the dim light. "Something good, I think. You look peaceful." There was something in his tone, a tenderness that made my heart do complicated things against my ribs. We looked at each other across the small distance that separated us on the couch, and I felt the weight of all the things we were not saying press against the silence. His hand moved then, just slightly, fingers shifting across the fabric of the couch until they found mine. Not grasping, not urgent, but deliberate, warm, heavy with meaning that neither of us was ready to speak aloud. The touch lasted only a moment before he pulled his hand away, but the ghost of it lingered on my skin like a brand. In the morning, when we woke properly and went about the business of disentangling ourselves from sleep and blankets and each other, neither of us mentioned it. But I carried the memory of that touch with me throughout the day, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone worn perfect by water. The weight of his fingers against mine, the warmth that had radiated up my arm and settled somewhere behind my ribs where it continued to burn with quiet intensity. I began to understand that we were walking a tightrope stretched between friendship and something else, something that felt too large and too fragile to name. Each night brought us closer to the edge, to the place where one of us would have to speak the truth that was growing between us in the dark. That night, as I waited for his knock, I wondered what would happen when we finally fell, whether the landing would destroy us or teach us how to fly. The knock came at 11:37. I had been watching the clock, though I told myself I was not waiting. When I opened the door, Desmond stood there empty-handed, his eyes holding something I had never seen before, something that looked like courage gathering itself for a leap. Neither of us said anything as he settled onto the couch, as I joined him in the space that had become ours. But when his hand found mine in the darkness, this time he did not pull away. It happened on a Tuesday night in January when the cold had settled into the city's bones like an old ache that would not fade. Desmond arrived earlier than usual, just after 9, carrying snowflakes in his dark hair and something different in his expression. Not the careful casualness he usually wore, but something rawer, more uncertain. He shed his coat and boots with unusual quiet, moving through the familiar ritual of claiming the couch with none of his typical easy confidence. I made tea without being asked, Earl Grey with honey the way he had mentioned liking it weeks ago. When I handed him the mug, our fingers brushed in the exchange, but this time neither of us pretended it was an accident. We sat in our usual configuration, close enough that the heat from his body warmed the air between us. But something was different tonight. The silence felt charged, expectant, like the moment before lightning splits the sky. He stared at his tea for a long time, watching steam rise and dissipate in the amber light from the street. I found myself studying his profile, the way his jaw worked, as if he were chewing words he could not quite swallow. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "Sometimes I don't knock because I need warmth." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and dangerous. I felt my heartbeat shift into a different rhythm, something urgent and unsteady that made it hard to breathe properly. "Sometimes I knock because I need you." The admission fell into the silence like a stone through water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood about us, about these nights we had been sharing, about the careful distance I had been maintaining between what I wanted and what I allowed myself to have. I set my mug down on the coffee table with hands that were not quite steady. The small sound seemed enormous in the quiet of the room. "And which was it tonight?" I asked, though I was not sure I was ready for the answer. He turned to look at me then, and in his eyes I saw something I had been afraid to recognize in my own reflection. Want, an uncertainty, and a kind of desperate honesty that made my chest tighten with recognition. "Both," he whispered. The word landed between us with the weight of a confession, changing the chemistry of the air we were breathing. I felt something shift inside me, some careful structure I had built around my feelings finally beginning to crumble under the pressure of truth. For weeks, I had been telling myself stories about what this was. That we were friends who happened to share a couch sometimes. That his visits were about loneliness or cold, or any of the dozen explanations we had offered each other in the dark. That the way my heart raced when I heard his knock was simple kindness rather than something more complicated and dangerous. But looking at him now, seeing the way his hands trembled slightly around his mug, the way his breathing had gone shallow and careful, I understood that we had both been lying. That every night he had spent on my couch had been a small act of courage, a step toward this moment when one of us would finally speak the truth we had been dancing around. The silence stretched between us, thick and fragile. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city until it felt like we existed in a pocket of absolute stillness, suspended between what we had been and what we might become. I thought about all the nights I had lain awake after he left, turning over every casual touch, every shared glance, every moment when the air between us had felt charged with possibility. I thought about the way I had memorized the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the particular quality of his laugh, the way he looked when sleep had softened the restless energy that usually animated his features. I thought about the careful walls I had built around my life, the way I had organized everything to avoid exactly this kind of uncertainty, this kind of risk. But looking at him now, I realized that some things were worth dismantling every defense you had ever constructed. "The truth," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "is that I have been waiting for you to knock every night for longer than I want to admit." Something changed in his expression, then, surprise giving way to relief, giving way to something that looked like hope. The space between us on the couch suddenly felt both infinite and impossibly small. I had been telling myself that this was about friendship. I continued, the words coming easier now that I had started, that I was just being a good neighbor. "But the truth is that every time you leave, I count the hours until you might come back." He set his mug down beside mine, the small sound marking some kind of ending, some kind of beginning. When he looked at me again, his eyes held a question I was finally ready to answer. The distance between us was less than a foot, but it felt like the space between planets, vast and charged with gravitational pull. All it would take was one of us leaning forward, one small gesture to collapse the careful structure we had built around our wanting. Neither of us moved, but something had already changed irreversibly. The truth was out between us now, raw and fragile and real. The next night, I waited. I told myself I was not waiting, that I was simply going about my evening routine as I always did. I made dinner, washed the dishes, arranged my books for the next day's research. But underneath these familiar actions, I felt the electric tension of anticipation, the way the air changes before a storm breaks. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 11. At midnight, I found myself on the couch, staring at the door, my body coiled with an expectation I was afraid to examine too closely. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the settling sounds of the old building. I began to wonder if I had imagined the intensity of the night before, if the confessions we had shared had been too much, too fast, too fragile to survive the harsh light of a new day. By 12:30, I had convinced myself that Desmond had changed his mind, that the vulnerability we had shown each other had frightened him back to his own apartment, his own careful solitude. The thought sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold and sharp around the edges. I was preparing to admit defeat, to retreat to my bedroom and pretend that I had not been counting the minutes since sunset when I heard it. 3 soft taps, so quiet I might have missed them if I had not been listening for them with every fiber of my being. I opened the door before the sound had fully faded, and there he was. But something was different tonight. Gone was the easy confidence, the casual explanations, the careful armor of friendship that had protected us both for so long. Instead, he stood in my doorway, looking uncertain and raw, like someone who had stripped away every defense and was waiting to see if he would be accepted or rejected in his naked honesty. We looked at each other across the threshold, and I saw in his eyes the same question that had been burning in my chest all day. What happens now? What do we do with the truth we have spoken? This time, I did not wait for him to move first. I stepped aside, but as he passed me, I let my hand brush against his arm, a deliberate touch that felt like signing my name to a document I had not fully read but was willing to commit to anyway. He went to the couch, but instead of claiming his usual corner, he sat in the center, leaving space on both sides. An invitation, a choice. I sat beside him, closer than I had ever dared before, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough that when he breathed, I could see the slight movement of his chest beneath his sweater. We did not speak for a long time. The silence was different than it had been on previous nights, charged with new possibility, but also heavy with the weight of everything we had admitted to each other. I found myself acutely aware of every small sound. The whisper of fabric when he shifted position, the soft intake of his breath, the barely audible sound of his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm I had never seen from him before. Finally, he turned to me, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the amber glow from the street. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor I had never heard before, vulnerability stripped of all pretense. "I don't want to just keep you warm," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back all day and could no longer contain them. "I want to keep you." The admission hung in the air between us, brave and terrifying and beautiful in its simplicity. I felt something break open in my chest, some final barrier between what I wanted and what I was willing to reach for. Without giving myself time to think, to catalog all the ways this could complicate everything I had built my life around, I reached for him. My hand found his face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw, thumb brushing across the constellation of freckles on his cheekbone that I had memorized during all those nights of careful observation. His eyes fluttered closed at the touch, and I heard his breath catch in a way that made my heart race. For a moment, we stayed frozen like that, balanced on the edge of everything changing, both of us afraid to move forward and unable to move back. Then he leaned into my touch, and the distance between us collapsed like a dam, finally giving way to flood. His forehead rested against mine, our breathing mixing in the small space between us, and I could feel the rapid beat of his heart where his chest pressed against mine. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. "Neither do I," he whispered back, his lips so close to mine that I could feel the words as much as hear them. But his hand found mine in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a certainty that contradicted his words, and I understood that sometimes knowing how was less important than knowing why. We stayed like that, foreheads touching, hands clasped, breathing each other's air in the amber light of my living room. Outside, the city continued its restless motion, but inside, we had found something that felt like stillness, like coming home to a place I had not known I was searching for. Spring came early that year, but the nights were still cold enough to justify the ritual we had created. 3 months had passed since the night when everything changed, since the moment when careful friendship had given way to something deeper and more complicated and infinitely more necessary. The couch remained ours, but had transformed into something different now, a place where we belonged together rather than a place where we pretended to seek solitude in each other's company. The knock still came, sometimes earlier in the evening, sometimes well past midnight, but the tenor had changed entirely. There were no more excuses about broken heaters or restless nights. When Desmond knocked now, it was with the confidence of someone who knew he would be welcomed, who understood that the door would always open for him. Sometimes he arrived with groceries, ingredients for late dinners we would cook together in my small kitchen, moving around each other with the practiced ease of people who had learned to share space without collision. Other times he came with his guitar, playing soft melodies that seemed to wrap around us like additional blankets, songs that had no words but somehow said everything we needed to hear. But most often, he arrived with nothing but himself, settling onto the couch with the familiarity of coming home. And I would join him there, not because he asked or because some unspoken protocol demanded it, but because the space beside him had become where I belonged. We shared the same cream-colored blanket now, the one that had witnessed the slow transformation of our careful distance into intentional closeness. It had become soft with washing, worn thin at the edges from all the nights it had covered us both, a textile chronicle of every moment we had spent learning each other's rhythms. Sometimes we fell asleep tangled together, my head on his shoulder, his arm around my waist, our legs intertwined in configurations that spoke of trust and comfort and the particular intimacy that comes from choosing to be vulnerable with another person. Other nights we stayed awake until dawn, talking in the low voices that late hours seemed to require, sharing stories and dreams and fears we had never spoken aloud before. He told me about the music he wrote in the hours between midnight and sunrise, melodies that came to him like visitations from some place he could not name. I told him about the historical figures I studied, the quiet revolutionaries who had changed the world through letters and conversations and small acts of courage that only became visible in retrospect. We discovered that we both collected moments the way other people collected stamps or coins, cataloging small instances of beauty or meaning that might otherwise be lost to the relentless forward motion of time. The way afternoon light looked when it slanted through old windows. The particular quality of silence that came just before snow began to fall. The sound of laughter echoing in empty hallways. One night in early April, as we lay together in the amber light that had become the signature illumination of our shared hours, Desmond spoke into the quiet with the voice of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time. "Do you remember," he said, "that first night when I knocked? When I asked you to keep me warm?" "Of course," I said, though the memory felt like something from another lifetime, from before I understood what warmth could actually mean. "I was so cold that night," he continued, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. "But not from the weather. From something else. Something I couldn't name, but couldn't ignore." I waited for him to continue, sensing that this was one of those conversations that required patience, that would reveal itself in its own time. "I had been feeling empty for months," he said finally, like there was this space inside me that nothing could fill. "I tried everything. Music, people, staying busy, staying alone. But nothing worked. And then I knocked on your door, and you let me in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt warm from the inside out." He paused, his breathing settling into the deeper rhythm that meant he was searching for words that mattered. "It wasn't about the couch or the blanket or even the company," he said. "It was about you. About the way you made space for me without making me feel like I was taking up too much room. About the way you were quiet without making me feel like I needed to fill the silence." I turned in his arms so I could see his face, could read the sincerity in his expression. In the amber light, he looked exactly like the person I had been falling in love with night after night, conversation by conversation, shared breath by shared breath. "I finally understood what I had been asking for," he said, his voice soft but certain. "It was never just warmth. It was belonging. It was home." Outside, the city continued its restless motion, people hurrying through the late spring night toward their own destinations, their own versions of warmth and shelter and connection. But inside my apartment, on the couch that had become our sanctuary, we had found something that felt permanent in the best possible way. The nights were still cold enough to justify staying close, but I knew now that when summer came, when the weather no longer provided convenient excuses for seeking each other's warmth, Desmond would still knock at my door. And I would still open it, not because he needed shelter from the cold, but because we had discovered something rare and precious in the space between us. He knocked because he had found his home, and I opened the door because I had found mine.